So these are sort of results and knowledge, I should say, of anthropogenic, which you remember is human-caused, genic global warming. So the reason why we're warming today is because anthropogenic processes or human processes are adding materials to the systems, and then we're getting these feedback loops. And one of the things that we have is this IPCC. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is actually an international organization, hence the intergovernmental. And this is just a group of international scientists that report on what climate change, and right now it's global warming, report on what climate change has done to ecosystems. They also recommend solutions to these problems. Oopsies, I'm running out of room. So some of the reports that they've done I've put on here. So you can see they've talked about climate change and land. So, and then it's a summary for policymakers. So they've organized it where they say this is what is happening. These are the changes that are happening to terrestrial resources because of climate change. And here's some policies that could help remediate or slow the changes or reverse the changes. And then here you can see they talk about what's going to happen if the world warms by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if we look up back here, remember today we have already increased by 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is sort of saying what's happened to the planet since we've increased by 1.5 degrees Celsius, this last one. And then this one here is talking about the ocean and the cryosphere. The cryosphere, this is talking about ice sheets and glaciers. If you think of cryogenic, that's freezing things. So cryosphere is the frozen sphere. And so this one is talking about what has happened with climate change and our ocean and ice. And then it says, here's a summary for policymakers, so that gives them some possible solutions to remediate the changes that we're seeing. And I actually do remember what I was going to say on the previous slide. And I'll talk about it here. So I said 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is actually not very much of a change. It's 1 degree, 1.5 degrees. But what you have to realize that this is, and this is important, this is actually the average. Actually, I should write out that it is the global average. So while it might not seem like much, we actually see extreme change at the poles in temperature, and then little change at the equator. So because we have little change happening at the equator, it sort of diminishes what it sounds like is happening up at the poles. So if we have maybe the temperature drops by 2 degrees at the equator, but it changes by 10 degrees at the pole, you're only seeing an overall change of maybe 8 degrees. So it doesn't look like a whole lot because what's happening at the equator sort of overshadows what's happening at the pole. So the equator overshadows the poles. That's why we talk about the ocean and the cryosphere a lot, because the equator is already warm and it's humid. The organisms there are used to warm, they're used to humid, they're happy. But the changes we're seeing at the poles, it's warming and the organisms there are not used to warmth. So, I mean, if we remember, I was talking about the mosquitoes, and I said, look, in the tropics, it's as red in 2080 as it is today. So there's no change happening there. All the change is happening way up here in the temperate and polar zones. So because nothing's happening at the equator, it minimizes what's actually happening at the pole. So we have to take that into consideration when we're talking about global temperature change, because it's actually just talking about the overall average and not sort of latitudinal averages. So because we have this IPCC, there have been sort of international agreements on how to mitigate climate change. And the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, this is the first international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the nations that signed this, so those that signed, nations that signed it, agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percent by a certain date. And this happened in the mid-90s. So this is when climate change really started to take off. So this is when international focus on global warming started. Now you can see there's many different colors in this agreement phase, because there are sort of different agreements that we have within different nations. So we can see there is a first period to meet and then a second period to meet, and then there was no periods or ones that were there but then they left because they realized that it was not going to happen. So we can see that there were different acceptances between certain nations for this Kyoto Protocol. So it was saying, well, we produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. There's no way we can make it to this level by the target date, but we will make it to this level by the target date. So you can see the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol, but we didn't really agree to any of the deadlines or any of the target goals. So in the U.S., we pretty much said, yes, it's a problem. But we're not 100% committed to the goals because we knew our economy would not be able to handle the changes that we would have to make to reach those goals. So it was just not economically feasible. We realize it's a problem, but our country can't afford to make the changes in order to meet the agreements of the Kyoto Protocol. So this was the first one that was out there to sort of get it, let everyone know that, oh, look, we should probably do something to save our planet. And then the most recent international agreement we have is the Paris Agreement in 2016, and I'm going to say 2017. So this is actually replacing the Kyoto Accord, Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto. And that's because most nations didn't meet their goal. Economies didn't cooperate. The technology was just too cost prohibitive. For many reasons, they just couldn't meet the goal. So what we've done is we've updated the goals since it's been 20 years, and we have new commitments. So whether these are now appropriate or not has still to be seen, because it was just signed a few years ago. So what we have now is, instead of reducing, I think the focus is on reducing global warmth more so than greenhouse gas emissions. So there are other ways to reduce global warmth other than greenhouse gas emissions. So this one actually has more options to reduce warming. And these are all the nations that signed it over here in this lovely little graph. So we can see the EU signed it and ratified it. It was in Paris, so hopefully, oh look, France did do it. The states in purple, they agreed to it, but not to 100% commitment. So the light purple, I guess we should go light purple. Light purple is actually committed to change. But this is at lower than maximum levels, than maximum goal, I should say. And then the yellow nations, these guys agree it's good to do, but economically can't do it. Similar to the United States in the Kyoto Protocol. They agreed that it had to be done. They just couldn't commit to the levels that were in the protocol. And then the blank ones, these are no signers. So no sign, no sign. If we jump into the Middle East here, Syria, I think, is a no sign. They've got other problems going on. So I think there's only 3 or 4 countries that did not sign on to the Paris Agreement to help mitigate global warming. So we have these international agreements saying, all right, as a species, we need to make changes to continue to ensure the continuation of our species. And to do that, we need to change things to reduce our impact on the feedback systems. So here's what we're going to do to help reduce our impact on the feedback systems. And almost everyone in the planet agrees to it. So that is sort of how humans have addressed the actuality of global climate change and commitments to reduce the human or the anthropogenic impact on our climate change.